Okay, so for most of the webinar today, we're going to be looking at how to develop a performance measurement framework. Now, I know that most of you have already been through this process, and we really want to be as thorough as possible with this webinar. So some of this might be a bit basic and it might be a review, but we're also hoping that we can dive a little bit deeper into developing strong indicators and just making sure that every component of the PMF is very strong. So, and can everybody hear me okay? So, what's the purpose of developing a performance measurement framework? Well, as you know, the main reason that we do this is that we want to know that we're accomplishing our outcomes. A PMF is a plan to systematically collect relevant data over the entire life of a program so that you know if you're achieving the results that you set out to achieve. The PMF helps us use all the information that we've captured in the log frame to develop a monitoring and evaluation plan so that every piece of the program, from implementation right through to the final evaluation, flows in a really logical way. The PMF is built on the expected results from the log frame, but it goes further than the log frame does, and it helps us identify the indicators, which is the type of information that we need to measure our results, the data sources, which is where we're going to look for this information, the data collection methods, which is how we're going to gather the information, the frequency, which is when we will gather the information, and the responsibility. So whose role is it to collect all the different pieces of information? The PMF summarizes your M&E plan, usually on a one-page document.
I'm getting a lot of notes here that it's difficult. People are finding it difficult to hear Kristen. Can everyone just type in the type box a yes or a no as to whether or not you can hear Kristen? Okay. Um, Thanks, Wafa. Kristen does have a very nice radio style voice. Um, maybe keep letting us know, and we'll do what we can to help make sure that you can hear okay.
All right, so I'll try to speak a little bit louder, and maybe that will help. And I'll try to speak as slowly as I can as well. So the PMF summarizes your M&E plan, usually on a one-page document that is easy to read and that clearly shows the logical flow of the measurement process as it relates to your expected results. And so in that sense, it can be a very useful tool. And it's great to have this one-page M&E program plan or map that you can refer to. It allows us to collect information about the program performance over the life of a program. It also provides managers and stakeholders with real-time information about things like the use of resources, how many children and communities the program has reached, the progress that is being made towards achieving outputs and outcomes. And it helps managers and stakeholders make informed decisions and address challenges as they arise. And of course, this helps improve the effectiveness of the program, and it increases the likelihood that you'll achieve the outcomes and the impact that you're aiming to. So as I mentioned, your log frame forms the basis of the PMF. So let's recap for a moment and look at our log frame. Starting at the bottom, we have our activities, which everyone is very familiar with. And this is the work that Right to Play is going to do in order to achieve the results. The outcomes, the outputs, and the impact are the results that we expect to see from the work that we put in. And it's these specific results that we copy and paste into our PMF. And this is what is our starting point when we develop the PMF. Just like a log frame, the PMF is a matrix that's designed to link your program's expected results to every component in the measurement plan in a very logical and orderly way. For the purposes of developing a PMF, you really only need to take the outcomes and the outputs from your log frame. You don't need to be concerned about the impact, and as I mentioned, you also don't need to copy the activities. So it's the outcomes and the outputs that you start with. And from here, you build the rest of your PMF, moving from the indicators to your data sources, to your data collection methods, the frequency that you collect the information, and then you identify who is responsible for collecting each piece. So here I've put together just a very brief, summarized PMF that we can work on together through the course of the webinar. You'll notice that the outcomes, I've included a few different areas. So we have improved positive attitudes about school, improved teaching methodologies, improved hygiene behaviors. And I just want to make a note that when we use words like improved, it can be a little bit vague. And so one thing that you need to keep in mind as you're developing both your log frame and your PMF is that you really want to have a good understanding of what improve means. What are the real changes that you want to see? What constitutes as something actually getting better and having a positive change over time? Because if I ask each of you what improve means, I might get a completely different response from every single person. So it's important that you outline this very clearly and that you define this at the outset of the PMF development process. And then the next step is taking these outcomes and these outputs and flushing them out to define your changes so that you can develop your indicators. Probably the easiest part of the PMF is copying and pasting the outcomes and the outputs. It's a much more challenging process to actually go through and develop indicators if you do end up developing them from scratch. So what exactly is an indicator? The indicator is the type of information that we need in order to measure our results. We want to know, what does the outcome look like? What does this mean in terms of the day-to-day, real-life situation of the children and the communities that we work with? What changes do we need to see in order to know that we're achieving our outcome? Now, to develop your indicators, the first place that you can go is you can check the global indicators that are in section 4T of the global outcomes and indicators in the M&E Guide and Toolkit. And this is a great starting point. And there are quite a lot of indicators that are listed there that correspond to a whole bunch of different program components. But of course, you may end up having activities and outputs and outcomes that look a little bit different than what's in the global guide. And so in that case, you might need to develop your own indicators based on your own unique program and what's taking place. But either way, you need to understand what a strong indicator is, and that's going to be our focus for the next little while. So a good starting point when you're looking at your outcomes and your outputs and thinking about indicators is to look at the theory of change. What is it that you want to change in terms of access, in terms of awareness, knowledge, skills, and behavior? And that's kind of a good starting point as you begin to develop the different aspects of the PMF. Looking a little bit more closely at what makes a good indicator, we've come up with a list of different criteria. So the first is, are your indicators comprehensive? Do you have indicators for every level of change? Do you have enough indicators for each result? Are your indicators valid? Will you actually be able to measure your result with that particular information? Are they reliable and sensitive? Will your indicator consistently measure your results over time? And when the results change, will your indicator show that change as well? Are they measurable? Can you actually measure it? Is it feasible? Do you have multiple perspectives represented in your data sources? Are your indicators usable, and will they actually provide you with useful information for program management? Are they affordable, and do you have the budget and the resources to actually collect the information? So when we talk about indicators being comprehensive, uh, we want to make sure that we have enough indicators for each result. We often talk about having or aiming for 2 indicators for each outcome and each output, but this isn't really a golden rule, it's just a guideline. You always just need to make sure that you have enough information to measure your results. Sometimes we can see if we've achieved the results with just one indicator, but sometimes we need multiple indicators. And every indicator also has a cost associated with it. So we want to have enough to know that we're measuring the outcome, but we don't want to have more than we need or more than we can afford. So 2 is usually good, but sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less, and that's also okay. Also, sometimes donors specify how many indicators they want to see. So maybe we have to combine indicators into one to reach the donor requirements. You also want to make sure that you have indicators for every level of change. So again, for both your outputs and your outcomes. But also you want to make sure that your indicators cover changes in access, changes in awareness, knowledge, skills, and behavior, so that you're able to really see if you're having results on each of these levels. So I've included an example here of an outcome, which is improved teaching methodologies amongst participating teachers by the end of December 2014. And I've listed a number of example indicators there, such as the percent of teachers who demonstrate knowledge of effective right to play teaching techniques, the percent of teachers that effectively integrate right to play methodologies into their classroom, and the teachers and the school directors that describe examples of how they've effectively integrated right to play methodology into the classroom. And the fourth, children describe classroom teaching methods that are more active and participatory. So here we have a number of different levels of change. We're talking about the teacher's knowledge. We're talking about a change in the teacher's behavior. We're getting different perspectives on it as well. So the children's experience and their access to more participatory and more active learning, not just the teacher's perspective on it. Down below, I've given an example of a less comprehensive indicator. And of course, this is just one indicator, which probably wouldn't be strong enough to cover every change that you want to see with regards to teaching methodologies. And so that's percent of teachers that believe children should participate in an active way. And here, the indicator is focused on the teacher's attitudes and beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily cover their knowledge, and it doesn't cover changes in behavior. I just want to make another note about some of these indicators. Once again, I'm using the word effective, and I've put it in quotation marks. And when you use a word like effective, similar to what I just mentioned about using words like improve, you really want to define what you mean by effective teaching techniques. What do they need to be doing? What do they need to know? You really want to define it. And it's good if you write these sorts of things down and include them on your PMF, because anyone should be able to take a look at your indicators and have a good understanding of what needs to be done and what information needs to be collected.
And just as a note, too, when we're looking at defining some of these words, some of this, as a reminder, some of this will be defined for us through our theory of change. So we want to be, especially in our theory of change, we want to be understanding these words such as effective consistently throughout the organization, just in the same way that it's consistent. It's important for us to do consistent measurement. So, whenever you're first looking to understand what these words are, you should always start with the theory of change and look at whether or not there's already a definition created in the organization. If you don't find it, it would be good to ask first in your country office, and then either your regional office or us here at HQ, to see if there's one in the organization. And if not, if it's something that's specific to your country, that's when you'll need to sit down with your country office and have a conversation about really understanding how does this look like? What does this look like?
You also want to make sure that your indicator is valid and that it actually directly measures your result. A lot of our outcomes and our outputs and our expected results are somewhat linked or related to one another. So when you're developing your indicators, you want to make sure that they're very specific and very closely linked to the specific outcome or output that you're measuring. So in this example, our outcome is improved positive attitudes about school among participating children by the end of December 2014. So examples of valid indicators would include the percent of children reporting positive associations with school, and parents, teachers, and children describe children's positive associations with school. I've also given some examples of less valid indicators, such as literacy and numeracy rates by age, percent of teachers reporting increased critical thinking skills among students, percent of teachers believing that children should participate in an active way. Now, all of these indicators that I've listed as invalid are related to education outcomes, and they might be linked in an indirect way to children's positive attitudes. Because if children have good attitudes towards school, they might engage and perform better. But the thing is that these invalid indicators don't specifically measure a change in attitudes. So even though they measure something related to education, it's not specific to the children's attitudes, which is why I've listed it as invalid indicators. You also want your indicators to be reliable and sensitive. So will your indicator consistently measure your results over time? And when the results change, will your indicator show that change? And will it show that change relatively quickly after the change has occurred rather than a long way down the road? So, as an example of an output here, community sensitization events held to improve understanding of hygiene, sanitation, and prevention of waterborne diseases. An example of a reliable indicator would be the level of participation by community members in the community sensitization events, or percent of community members demonstrating awareness of good hygiene and sanitation practices. An example of an unreliable indicator would be community members report practicing good hygiene and sanitation behaviors. And while this unreliable indicator is related to our results, because it is related to hygiene and sanitation. It's unreliable for a few reasons. Our output is about changing awareness and knowledge. And of course, you need to improve awareness and knowledge before you start to see behavior change. But behavior change generally takes longer than changes in knowledge and awareness. And so this indicator would not be a reliable indicator because behavior may not change as consistently or at the same rate that changes in knowledge and awareness take place. So if you want to measure changes in awareness and knowledge, you're better off using an indicator that focuses specifically on those things rather than on behavior change. And so that as your results change, your indicator will also change at the same rate. You really want an indicator that will measure change soon after the activity is done and also down the road to make sure that the change is lasting. And that's what we mean when we talk about reliable indicators. Of course, you also want indicators that are measurable. Can you actually measure it? Can you gather the information that you need? And when you're considering this, you also need to be aware of external factors that might affect your ability to get the information. So, for example, if our outcome is improved good hygiene behaviors among participating children by the end of December 2014, an example of a measurable indicator would be percent of children that demonstrate good hygiene practices at school. A non-measurable indicator might be the percent of children that demonstrate good hygiene practices at home. And again, the example here, the non-measurable indicator, is certainly relevant to our outcome, and it would provide useful information about our results. But it's probably not feasible to observe all the children's hygiene practices at home, and it may not be appropriate for a right to play staff member or facilitator to visit the children at their home to observe them in this way. And so while you can ask them about their hygiene practices at home, it's probably better to measure their knowledge generally rather than drawing firm conclusions about hygiene practices, or to observe them in a place where it's a little bit more feasible and a bit more manageable. You want to have indicators that represent a variety of different perspectives. And if you collect information from different people and different data sources, it helps verify and strengthen your data. This is known as triangulating the data. So, for example, if our outcome is improved positive attitudes about school among children, to get multiple perspectives, your indicators might involve collecting information from children, such as the percent of children who report positive associations with school. And it might also involve collecting information from parents and teachers, as well as children, to have them more qualitatively describe the children's positive associations with school. And so here you're getting the parents, the teachers, and the children's perspectives, and you're maybe even getting the children's perspectives in two different ways. You also want to make sure that your indicators are useful. Specifically, are they useful to program management? Will the information be valuable for decision making, for learning, for making adjustments or improving the program? So, as an example of an output, we have teachers trained and certified to effectively deliver right to play modules. So, useful indicators might include the number of teachers that have completed the training and certification, the percent of teachers demonstrating improved knowledge on active play, or the participants' level of satisfaction with the training. Now, each of these indicators would be useful to your program in different ways. If we know the number of teachers that have completed the training, then we have a better idea of how many teachers might be implementing it, how many classrooms we're going to be working with and following up with. If we know the percent of teachers that are demonstrating improved knowledge of active play and right to play modules, Then we start to get a sense of how effective our training has been. And is this actually an effective way to transfer the knowledge to teachers? And the participants' level of satisfaction with the training is useful in planning future training events. Maybe there's things that didn't work so well that we want to change, and maybe there's aspects that worked particularly well that we want to use more often. And last but not least, you want to make sure that your indicators are affordable. Do you have the budget and the resources to collect the information? Do you have enough people to collect the information? Do they have enough time to collect it? There are some indicators that are very strong, but they actually require a lot of resources to collect the data. And so in that case, you need to weigh out the benefits and the costs of actually collecting them. Is that the best use of your time and your resources? So for example, if our output is community sensitization events held to improve understanding of hygiene, sanitation, and prevention of waterborne diseases, an example of an affordable indicator might be the percent of participants who report improved hygiene and sanitation knowledge following the event, which is something that we could measure in conjunction with the event. An example of an unaffordable indicator is the number of event participants who demonstrate improved hygiene and sanitation practices at their home. And again, as with the previous example, it's probably just not feasible to go talk to everybody or observe everybody and their hygiene practices at home. It would be great if we could spend that much time with people one on one, but chances are it's just not realistic or affordable. So I want to take a little break right now and just give Suzanne a chance to respond to some of your questions. And then we're going to do a short little practice where we're going to look at strong and weak indicators.
Okay, so there seems to be just a few questions in here, and they're both from Wafa. So thank you, Wafa. While we're looking at those questions, if anyone else has any questions specifically about indicators, or also if you have any challenges that you faced when you're trying to develop indicators, please feel free to type those in now. We want to take this opportunity to talk through a little bit about a little bit more about the indicators, just to make sure that we're clear and we're comfortable with them. While many of the indicators will indeed be coming from our theory of change and our measurement strategies, so many of them will already be developed for us. Whenever we're developing proposals and other things, there's often times when we do need to look at developing new indicators. So, and we need to be reviewing the indicators, even from the theory of change, against our own country resources and country context, based on the different conditions and considerations that Kristen has just laid out. So it's really important that we take this time and we really understand and feel comfortable with not only what indicators mean, but how we can identify a good, strong indicator for a particular outcome or a particular output. So please, if you have any questions or if you've experienced any challenges that you want to talk through, please feel free to type those in the box. Wafa, I wanted to look at two of your questions. The first one, I'm not sure. I wondered if you could provide a little bit more clarity. We're going to just unmute so that you can actually describe. Um, if you can just please
Yes.
specify what do you when you're talking about when you're asking about whether or not it reflects a specific action. What do you mean by the action?
That it shows a specific demonstration um, of the how to put that?
of the outcome itself?
Um, yeah, here we're talking about the at this part we're talking about the indicators, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And the indicator should, when we put our indicator to be measurable, then it should go specifically into a specific to be able to be measured well. So we need to add a specific, um, the like action words, action
Right.
verbs.
So,
Uh, this is what I meant by specific action
okay.
that is specific and can be seen and measured.
Okay. So that's just what I wanted
Not
to clarify. So
Yeah, it's not by seeing, not by vision. I mean, not by eyesight. Not necessarily, but can be like measured.
right. So I think the key
I
word
don't know if
here
yeah.
is that it needs to be something that can be measured, but it doesn't always. I guess when I hear action and I think about something like an action word or a verb or something that people are actively doing, the indicator doesn't necessarily have to be an action. It could be something of people describing it for us. It could be that they're showing it through a test so that they score well on a particular knowledge test. So I think the key word there is not that necessarily that it needs to be an action word. It's not that we need to always observe it or um, uh, or see it through an observation, but it needs to be something that's concrete and that's measurable. So when we say something like, for example, children have access or girls have access to education opportunities, what does that mean when we say access? So the access might be that attendance rates go up for children in education. It might be that girls report that they know that they can go to school and that they don't always have to stay home and do chores. So it might be a combination of different things, but it's not always an actionable word. Does that uh does that help specify?
Oh yes, thank you.
Okay, great.
Yes, it is clear. Thank you very much.
Okay. The other question,
Susan?
sorry, I just want to Jamal, actually, if you don't mind just typing it in, only because there's a
Okay,
few questions.
okay.
Um so when we so sorry, Wafa, your other question was looking at home and whether or not it's measured reportedly by parents and if it's reliable. And I just wanted to say that when we're looking at reliable, the slide that I'm just going to move it to the reliable slide. So when we're looking at reliable indicators, what we're looking at here is more that it's a direct measurement of the specific outcome itself. So let me just go back to your question here. So when you're talking about at home and whether or not that can be measured reportedly by parents, yes, that is something that parents could describe for us. But in this particular case, when the output was an improvement of understanding of hygiene, sanitation, and prevention of waterborne diseases, the key word there is understanding, which is really looking at awareness and knowledge. So we really want to be looking at the types of knowledge that people have and asking specifically about that. So the reason that the indicator that's Kristen has put in as an unreliable indicator is because it's looking at behaviors and it's making a jump from knowledge to behaviors. Um, does that help specify? Let me just unmute and I can. Wafa, does that answer your question?
Um, Yes, but I think I wanted to ask you if we can go back to that part, which the indicator that says at home. I think it's not on this slide. It's on one before.
Okay.
If we can, please.
The one before, the one on valid.
It's not an event. Yeah, this one, yes, non-measurable. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I was talking about this one.
Okay,
Um.
I see what you're
Yeah.
saying. So I think, yes, as a measurable indicator, we could add down that in a focus group that parents report.
Yes.
Sorry, we're gonna mute because we just suddenly got an.
Yes, please.
So I think we could say as a good measurable indicator that parents report that children are practicing good hygiene at home. I think the key thing here that makes it a non-measurable indicator is that we're saying that the percentage of children demonstrate. So when we use the word demonstrate, it's using some sort of observable thing that we can see. And when we say percentage of children, we're talking about all children, all participating children. So that means that we need to go and actually observe children in their home, which isn't something that's feasible. So so sorry, just to mix up with the screen there. So hopefully that clarifies. Does that help?
Yes, a lot. Thank you. Thank you. It is. Yeah.
Moving down with some of the other comments. Mary Sue, I'm just reading your comment here. Probably it is a problem of translation. We're like the indicators. Okay, we're going to, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your question as well. So, Mary Sue, which part of it? Yes, sometimes the indicators are like the activities, where if we're talking about an output being the number of children that have participated, or that say our output is that 2,000 children participate in right to play programs twice a week. The indicator will be the number of children that participate. So it's a very concrete way. The output indicators are usually quite easy to do because they're usually things that are very specific. Usually our outputs are very concrete already. Um, does that help, Mary Sue, or is there something else that is confusing you?
Hi, can you listen to me? Yeah, right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, the confusion I had. Yeah, I understand that as you were saying, but when I was looking at the slides, when it says in some of the slides we're talking about outcomes, the way they were written, it confuses me a little bit because for me outcomes, I mean, outputs were only like number of children that or number of events, like something really concrete. So, and in some of the slides, I don't know which one, but it said like output, and the way it was written, I thought it was something else, like the knowledge or something like that. So I wanted to be sure.
I'm just looking at I'm looking at the slides. There's two
Yeah.
slides that Kristen showed that have outputs on them. One
Mm-hmm.
is that she showed that
Could
teachers
you,
trained and certified to
yeah,
effectively
could you show
deliver
it maybe or?
modules. So that one is an output because it is the completed
Action.
action. So the
Mm-hmm.
activity would be that we would be training and certifying teachers, and it's an output because it's something that that if teachers attend the training, we can absolutely say that the teachers have been trained. They've gone through that particular training process.
But the way that the output should be written shouldn't be like a number of people, of teachers trained and
Mhm.
certified. I'm talking about the way the output is written.
So
I
what
understand
would
what.
okay, so what would the suggestion be?
No, like I'm asking, like, for example, in that slide,
Yeah.
the output should be written like in general. If you're doing a log frame,
Hmm.
the output should be written like a number of teachers being trained and certified, or something like. You don't have to. You
Yeah,
don't have to put
Yeah.
it written like that. Yeah, right.
well, it could
Yes.
be. It
Oh,
definitely
okay.
could be. The indicator
Uh-huh.
would be the number of teachers, as it's written in the first bullet there, the number of teachers that
Mm.
have completed the training and that have been
Mm.
certified. And that one we could actually separate into two indicators because there's the number of teachers that have completed the training, and then there's another process that they go through to be certified. So we may actually have two different numbers for that.
Mm.
So we could say number of
Mm-hmm.
teachers that have completed the training and then number of teachers that have been certified. Um, but the output itself, we could put a target in there and we could
Mm-hmm.
say that 65 teachers have been trained and certified. And that would mean that they've done both. That 65 teachers have been trained and 65 teachers
Mm-hmm.
have been certified. If we think
So.
that
Mm-hmm.
only 50 of those teachers
Mm-hmm.
that went through the training would be certified, then we could say 65 teachers have been trained and 50 of those teachers have been certified to effectively deliver right to play modules.
So in that sense, the output could be like, I mean, the output could be used as kind of an indicator in that sense,
It
because you're
could be,
putting like a specific number or
yeah.
percentage.
The outputs, for outputs, you find that they're often very closely written between the indicator
Mm-hmm.
and the output itself. And the reason for that is often because the outputs themselves are already so concrete. So when we talk
Mm-hmm.
about outcomes, we might say something like the that children have increased. Well, if we go back to our example of girls have increased access to education, access is not concrete. So we need to be able
Mm-hmm.
to use our indicators to understand what we're going to be measuring to determine whether or not girls have access to education. So, so in that case, sometimes in our outcomes, the indicators are not exactly the same. They're measuring the outcomes, but they're described a little bit differently and more concretely. When we're talking about our outputs, as you're pointing out,
Mm-hmm.
the outputs are already very concrete. When we say
Yeah.
65 teachers trained, the indicator is the number of teachers trained. Like it's very, and that's why I'm saying the indicators for outputs are usually quite easy. Usually, not always. Usually
Mm-hmm.
quite easy. Does that make sense?
Um, yeah, it was a kind of a little bit confusing, because when I think about a logic frame, I'm gonna think about like first the results and some indicators for those results, and after those results, for each results we have a number of activities. So and for each activities we have some specific indicators, and those indicators is the ones that I thought they were called outputs, you know,
Okay.
like so that was my difficult like the confusion I had, because when I was doing the planning for next year and I didn't understood the difference, I asked you guys, and that's the definition that I got, kind of. So I understood, but now with this, the way they're written here, I'm confused again. But yeah,
Okay.
maybe if I see it in a log frame.
Yeah, maybe if we can come back to this, maybe once, because I know
Yes.
Christian has some slides further on that
Yeah, no
have
worry.
it
Yeah.
all lined up within one chart, and maybe that will help a bit. If not, then maybe we can connect a little bit further. Can I just ask, without getting into too many details, because I want to touch on some of the other questions, but can I just ask, are other people also confused by this, or is it something, I'm wondering whether this is something to discuss as a group or to send something out, or whether this is something that we can chat about. So just basically a yes or no from people. You're unmuted right now. Is this something that is confusing for other people, or is it clear?
It's clear to me.
Okay. Clear. Okay. So Mary Sue, I think it's something that let's connect on this afterwards, if it's still confusing.
Okay,
That
no problem.
okay? Great. Thanks. Um,
Thank you,
there was
Marisu.
okay.
No
There.
worries, Rafita.
I'm just looking at the question from Alice and Danica. It says, if we have 3 different project locations, does this mean that every location needs to have its PMF, or can we have a general one for the country? So, absolutely, that the PMF should be tied to a particular program. So, um, so we definitely do not need a PMF for each location, but but there may be different PMFs that are needed within one country. So if there are different programs that are trying to achieve different outcomes, each of those programs will need its own PMF because you will have to develop, sorry, a measurement plan for each of those programs. So when you're developing those different PMFs, it would be helpful to try and make them as aligned as possible, because if you can use the same tools, that will be easier and will require less resources. So it will be important to look at them and to see, if some of the outcomes are the same in the 2 different programs, then it would be helpful probably to use the same measurement approach for those 2 different outcomes. But each program will need its own PMF. Does that, Alice and Danica, does that help clarify?
Yeah, that is fine. It's clear for me.
Okay, great, thank you. Um,
Great to hear your voice, Alice.
Yeah.
Not only Alice, but also Marisu, cutie.
And you too, Walter.
yeah, absolutely. Jamal, I'm just going to move to Jamal's question. Jamal is asking, what about the percentage for the indicators? Is it fine to mention it without any specific value? That's a good question, Jamal. I think for the indicators, we have one up on the screen right now, which is helpful. So we have the percentage of teachers demonstrating improved knowledge of active play and right to play modules. So in our indicator, we can, as a general rule, write down the percentage of teachers. Usually in our outcome, and something like knowledge might often be an indicator of an outcome. So if we're using this particular indicator to demonstrate teachers that have, to show teachers that have demonstrated improved knowledge, in our outcome, we might want to say 80% of teachers demonstrate improved knowledge. So we might want to put a target on that, so we know what percentage of teachers we're trying, will indicate to us that the program has been successful. Our indicator is the percentage. So our indicator is actually going to not necessarily state how many teachers, but will be a clear will clearly show what we're going to be looking for as a way of defining whether or not the outcome has been achieved. Again, what makes this tricky is that some donors look for different things. So some donors want you to specify the target, so the 80% in the indicator instead of the outcome. At Right to Play, generally, we will usually put the target within the outcome itself or within the output. But we will need to check with donors to see what their preference is. And when you're writing proposals, you may need to switch that to make sure it's in line with the donor's requirements. I know it would be much easier if we all spoke the same language and wanted things in the same way, but different donors look for different things. Does that help, Jamal?
Yes, but Kristen, I have another question. It's clear now.
Okay.
So, but about the, like, if we mention like 80%, so after 3 years after the project finished, you are talking about 80% from the whole project or from the sample size of the project that we took for the final evaluation?
It would be for the sample size. But
Sample
if
size,
we're
okay.
using a percentage, that means
Uh-huh,
that we need to use a large enough sample
uh-huh.
to to be a large enough sample that is representative of the full population. So I'm not,
Okay.
I don't want to get into right now how we determine
Uh-huh, okay.
that sample. We'll
Okay.
we'll save that. We have an upcoming webinar on samples.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the percentage will be um, it'll be what we want to know is that 80% of all of the cases, but in order to measure that, we will be looking at a sample size. Does that help? I'm going to assume that that helps because I'm not hearing anything back. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for the questions. I think it was important that we take the time to talk through. If you have more questions, please continue to send them along, and by email to either Kristen, Colleen, or I. And I'm going to pass it back to Kristen now so she can carry on with our presentation.
All right. Thanks, Suzanne. So the next thing that we're going to do here is I'm actually going to give you a chance to practice a little bit and to put what we've just discussed into use. So you'll see there's a chart here, and I have an outcome in the left-hand column and 5 different potential indicators in the right-hand column. Not all of these indicators are strong, but some of the indicators are strong. So I'm going to give all of you a few minutes to read through the indicators and then select the ones that you think are the strong indicators and then select the ones that you think are the weak indicators. So take a few minutes to read through them. If you don't get through all of them, that's okay. We don't expect everyone to be experts on developing indicators after a 1-hour webinar. So don't worry too much about it. But we just wanted to give you a chance to actually practice and start putting it into use a little bit. So we'll take 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'll come back and I'll talk about which ones I think are strong and which ones I think are weak. Okay, hopefully everybody's had a chance to read through at least a few of them. So you can see the strong indicators are the ones in red, and the weak ones are the ones that are in black. So for example, A, the percent of classes demonstrating active participation during learning activities. So this is an example of something that is measurable because we could go and we could actually observe the classes that are participating or where the teachers have participated. It's valid because it directly measures what our outcome is, which is improved active participation among children. It's reliable because it's likely to change quickly in relation to the change in the result. And it's useful in terms of measuring the performance of our program. B is an example of an indicator that is weak because percentage of children reporting positive associations with school isn't valid. It's not really getting at active participation. It's looking at something else, which is positive associations. And again, while it's related to some extent to our outcome, it's not that reliable because uh, a change in active participation in the classroom may or may not lead to an immediate change in positive associations with school. C is another example of a strong indicator. Teachers and school directors describe improvements in active participation among students. Again, this one is measurable. We could perhaps have focus group discussions or interviews with teachers and school directors. It's valid because it looks specifically at active participation. It's reliable because it's likely to change relatively quickly once teachers implement more active learning techniques. And again, it's useful in understanding the right to play programs. D is another example of a weak indicator, improved use of teaching methodologies that incorporate active learning into the classroom. And again, this is a bit of a tricky one because it's certainly related to the outcome on the left-hand column, but D is actually an outcome itself. It's not an indicator. So this is something else that another result that we might hope to see through our program. E is another example of a strong indicator, with the percent of teachers that report increased active participation among students. And again, this one is measurable, it's valid, it's reliable, and it's useful. And if we take our three strong indicators, which are A, C, and E, and if we use our existing tools in the toolkit, and if we plan according to our time and our budget, these are probably affordable indicators that we could actually feasibly gather information for. And if we include all three, we'll also capture a variety of perspectives by observing children and talking with the teachers and with the school directors. So in that sense, we're capturing multiple perspectives as well. So now that we've developed our indicators and we've put them into our PMF, let's move on to our data sources and talk about that. So the data source tells us who we're actually going to get the data from. These are the people, the organizations, the program records, or other documents where we get the data that we need to understand our program results. Examples could be the children and youth that participate, the parents or the caregivers of those children and youth, the leaders that are implementing different right to play activities, or the teachers, as well as partner organizations or other stakeholders that might be involved. And some of the data may be available from pre-existing sources, but you also need to plan to collect specific data for your programs. So you can't only rely on records or information from outside sources. When you're trying to identify good data sources, wherever possible, you want to identify multiple sources of data so that you can verify and triangulate your information. And this will also help increase your credibility and your program's credibility. You also need to review the feasibility of obtaining the data from these sources. Think about things like how much time will it take? How much money or resources will it require? Are these different data sources going to be available in your time frame? For example, if you have a really tight deadline, hopefully you don't because you've planned well ahead of time and accordingly. But if you have a really tight timeline, conducting a survey or gathering people together for focus group discussions might just simply take far too much time, energy, and money. But if you plan it well, you can work this into your annual planning and make it something that's feasible to do. I was going to have us do another short practice session of identifying data sources for our indicators, but I think I'm going to skip over the practice part of this and just sort of go through it verbally because we are coming kind of close to the end of our webinar and I don't want to take up too much extra time. Okay, so for your indicators, number one, the percent of children reporting positive associations with school. Of course, your data source for this is going to be the children themselves. And at this point, we just want to go through the data sources. We'll talk about data collection methods in just a moment. For number two, the parents, teachers, and children describe children's positive associations with school. And of course, it says right there in the indicator that we want to collect this information from parents, teachers, and children. Number three, the percent of teachers that are effectively integrating right to play methodologies into the classroom teaching practices. And again, for this, the data source will be the teachers themselves. And so on and so on. And you identify each data source according to what your specific indicator is. And quite often, just by reading the indicator, it becomes fairly obvious what the data source is or who the data source is. So we've plugged this into our larger PMF, and now we're going to talk about data collection methods. The data collection methods tell us how we're going to get the data that we need in order to measure the indicator. For the global toolkit, most of this has already been identified, but it's important that we know how to identify data collection methods because you may end up using methods that are not actually in the theory of change or in the toolkit if certain aspects of your program are unique. When you're choosing the most appropriate data collection method, you want to consider what type of indicator that you're trying to gather information for. Is it quantitative information like the number of children, or is it the percentage of teachers, for example? Or is it qualitative information where you're having parents, children, or teachers describe something to you? You also want to consider, are you trying to find out about changes in behavior, awareness, knowledge, skills, or access? And that's going to influence which type of data collection method you'll choose as well. You want to think about how the data is going to be used. For example, are you trying to understand participant satisfaction after an event or a training activity so that you can improve your training and your event planning? Or are you looking for some deeper level of measurement? For example, if your donor wants to know the number of children you've reached with a particular activity over time, you might need to go a lot deeper and collect more information and more detailed information about that particular activity and their related outputs and outcomes. So you want to really think about the depth of measurement. How rigorous? How many people? How detailed does it need to be? You want to think about the data source. If you're collecting information directly from people, you really need to consider their time and their availability. And how much of their time can you really take with collecting information about your particular program? Whether it's children or leaders or teachers, They all have busy lives outside of their right to play involvement, and we need to be really mindful of that. Of course, it also depends on the level of involvement. Whether they're participants, whether these are people that are actually implementing different aspects of right to play programming. That's going to affect the type of information that you collect from them and how you collect it. And of course, whether or not you're collecting information from a child or from an adult, because you're going to need to use different methods to ensure that it's appropriate for the person that you're actually speaking with and collecting information from. You also want to think about the practicality. Can you actually collect the data using that particular tool within your time frame and within your budget? Consider the ease or the difficulty of using a particular method. As I mentioned before, organizing surveys or focus group discussions is complicated, and it can take a lot of time and a lot of organization. And sometimes that's just not appropriate, sometimes it's not necessary, sometimes it's just not feasible for a particular result. You also want to look at the cost. As always, you want to make sure that you can actually collect the information with the budget and the resources that you have available. You want to look at the reliability of your tool. And we've been talking a lot about reliability throughout this webinar. But will your data collection method show changes in indicators at the same rate that your results change? Is it the right method to understand the results relatively quickly after an activity, as well as over the long term? And then you also want to think about how much time it's going to take. And again, things like surveys and focus groups take a lot more time than some of the other methods. So for each of the global indicators that are found in the M&E guide and toolkit, different data collection tools have been developed. And so these are some of the examples that are in the current guide and toolkit. As you know, we're still working on developing most of these, and we don't expect that everyone is super familiar with all of them at this point in time. And to be very honest, you may not be familiar with all of them because some of them won't be relevant to your specific programs in your country. And that's okay, because we're going to work through developing all of these together, and then we'll make sure that everybody's using the tools that are appropriate and relevant for their country. So don't be overwhelmed by this list. It was just meant to be a bit of an example of the different tools that we're working on at this point in time. So getting back to our PMF, on the right-hand column, we have our data collection methods. So for our indicator, for the very first one, the percent of children reporting positive associations with school, we know that our data source is the children, and our collection method, in this case, will be the child survey, and particularly the school perception component of the survey. For the second indicator, the parents, teachers, and children that describe children's positive associations with school, we're going to collect information from the parents, teachers, and children. And in this case, we're going to do focus group discussions, and we'll do separate focus group discussions with parents, separate groups with teachers, and then separate groups with children. For the third indicator, the percent of children, the percent of teachers effectively integrating right to play methodologies, our data source is teachers, and for this, we'll use the teacher observation tool and go to the classrooms themselves. And so for every single indicator that you have, you want to have specific data sources that directly link up to that indicator, and then you want to have the corresponding data collection method that directly links to your data source and thereby also links to your indicator. So here's our larger PMF where we've plugged in our data collection methods, and now we're going to talk about frequency. The frequency refers to how often we're going to get the data that we need to measure the indicator. For the PMF, frequency can be reported in terms of general milestones rather than exact dates. And with the exact dates, that's something that you'll outline in greater detail in other parts of your plan. But for the PMF, we just need to get a general sense of how often you're going to collect that information. So it might be quarterly, it might be semi-annually, it might be annually, baseline, midterm, or at the final evaluation of the program. There are a number of things that you want to consider as you're developing your frequency and filling out that part of the PMF. First of all, is it actually feasible to collect the information within that time frame? Are staff available? Are other resources available? For example, vehicles for transportation to program sites. What else is happening in your country office at that point in time? Does it make sense to try and collect information, or do you need to focus your energy elsewhere? For the participants or the data sources that are taking part in the surveys or the interviews, the focus group discussions, or that are being observed in other ways, participating in data collection can be emotionally and physically exhausting, particularly if we're asking personal questions, and it can also take them away from their regular activities, which adds additional pressures to their time. You also need to think about how often you're administering the same tools with the same participants. Because if you end up administering the same tools repeatedly in a short time frame, your participants might actually get a little bit bored, especially children who have shorter attention spans anyway. And then they may just end up wondering, why is this same person always coming and asking me the same questions about how I like school or what I know about malaria? Like, why does this person just keep pestering me about this? So you have to consider what is reasonable and what is appropriate when you plan how often to collect your data from participants. The frequency of data collection also depends on the phase of the program. New programs or pilot programs will likely require more data collection and more frequent data collection to ensure that they're on the right track. Whereas programs that are already established and where some of the results have already been tracked, and if they have a good track record, the monitoring schedule may require less frequent outcome assessments. You also need to think about your reporting requirements. Right to Play headquarters require reports on a quarterly basis, and with donors, it pretty much varies from one donor to another. So you want to make sure that your timelines for measurement line up with when you need to report on the information so that you have it available to share when you need it. And often we focus all of our attention on getting reports to headquarters and to donors. But it's just as important to provide information to program managers and decision makers so that they can continually improve and adjust program activities to make them as effective as possible. So you need to consider that when you're putting together your timelines and the frequency of data collection as well. When do the program managers and the staff in your country office need the information? And at the same time, you don't want to overload your program staff with more information than they can use. The frequency also depends on how deeply you're going to be measuring according to the measurement strategy. So back to our PMF. For the purposes of this example, we're going to assume that this is an in-school program. And so most of our data collection, as you'll see, is going to take place twice a year, specifically at the beginning and the end of the school year. And as you know, community programs might run a little bit differently. And so while you'll also try to collect information twice a year on outcomes, it may not necessarily coincide with the beginning or the end of the school year. And the responsibility, our last column in the PMF, refers to who will ensure that the data is collected. And so some of you wonderful people on the line here might be the ones who are directly responsible and involved. For example, for outcome monitoring, such as doing the surveys or the focus group discussions. In other cases, it might be other people who are involved in the program, such as the leaders or the leader supervisors, particularly in relation to output monitoring, such as attendance records or activity reports. Of course, these are just examples, and based on the staffing and the volunteer and the time frame at your specific country office, you'll develop a plan and you'll delegate responsibility accordingly. And so we've now filled out all the different columns of our PMF, and we're ready to get out there and measure. One important thing to keep in mind is you really want to balance the amount of information that you collect. And you need to really consider how much information do you really need. For many of our outcomes and outputs, we could develop a really long list of indicators, all of them which would be strong, which would be useful and interesting. But with a few indicators, if they're strong, you'll get a sense of your results, and additional indicators will verify what you already know, but they'll also start to repeat what you already know. And you'll get to a point where collecting more information from more data sources won't actually give you that much more additional information about your results. It's the point of information saturation. So you want to balance good, strong information, but not more information than you need, because that's costly and time consuming. And I'm going to take a little pause here. I think we have about 7 minutes left, and see if there's any more questions.
All right. And so really, other than people pointing out that everyone in our M&E picture is quite beautiful, says Alison Danica, um, uh, there really hasn't been any questions that people have put in the chat box. So if you do have any questions outstanding about anything that we've covered so far, or if you have any challenges that you've experienced, please put it in the chat box. And even if if it's longer and you don't want to type it all in, you can just put your name and just put questions so that we know to cue you for a question. It's kind of like indicating to the facilitator that you want to ask something. I just wanted to go back and make sure that everyone saw Alice and Danika's question, and I typed in the answer. But I just wanted to read that out because it might be a question that some other people have as well. So Alice and Danica had asked, if you say percentage of community members, does this mean you need to have the total population of that community and get the percentage that maybe demonstrates the behavior or knowledge that you're looking for? And my answer to that was no. You can use a sample, but we should try to use a sample size that is large enough to be generalized. And when we say generalized, we mean that if we're using 400 children, for example, in our sample size, we want to be able to say that that can be generalized, or that can be representative of the full of all of the children. So we need to have a number that's high enough that gives us confidence that whatever we're seeing within that sample is actually what is happening or is what has been achieved across the full population. So if we see 80% in the sample, we can feel confident that it's the same 80% in the whole population. And that really comes down to the size of the sample. What's important about this is that when we're talking about percentages, it does mean that we're looking for representative numbers. And for that reason, we often can't say percentage of community members that feel a certain way, because it's often very difficult for us to do a survey, for example, with 400 community members, meaning parents and community leaders and others in the community. So we often don't say percentage of community members. Instead, we talk about community members reports, which means that we've taken a smaller number of community members, usually through a focus group, and they've described something for us. So when we say percentage, we really are talking about large numbers, and we're talking about trying to get a representative number. So I hope that makes sense and is clear. I'm going to Alice and Danica, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't actually see anyone else with any questions or comments. Everyone's unmuted right now. So just to ask, does anyone have anything specifically that you wanted to ask while we're all together? I know this last part, I mean, I know lots of people are, well, everyone is preparing performance measurement frameworks. You're very familiar with some of these other items. So I'm gathering that's probably why there's not many questions, because a lot of this stuff is a review. But we thought it was important to spend the time to just go through all of these as a reminder, and also spend the time really talking about the indicators. So I'm gonna assume that that's all right. Great. So with that, I'm gonna pass it back over to Kristen to wrap up.
Okay. Now, in the last few minutes that we have left, I actually want to talk very, very briefly about developing a data collection plan, because most of you have been going through this process as part of the annual planning process. And your data collection plan and your PMF are very closely linked. So I just want to take about a minute to talk briefly about your data collection. Your data collection plan provides more details about what information you're going to collect and specifically when you're going to collect it. It's basically a month-by-month breakdown of what information is needed, the tools that you need to use, and who will be involved in collection. Most of the information required for the data collection plan can be copied directly from the PMF. The key difference is that the data collection plan has a column for each month where you simply place an X or a check mark if you're going to carry out that activity during that particular month. So looking back at our PMF, we're interested in the data collection methods, the frequency, and the responsibility, which are the three right-hand columns, and you copy and paste these directly into your data collection plan. And it's really important to mention that if you have a particular tool or activity listed in your PMF, it should absolutely appear in the data collection plan. So these two documents need to be very closely linked up, and every item in your data collection methods column of the PMF needs to appear in the data collection plan. So here you can see we've begun to fill out the time frame for when the different data collection activities are going to happen and who's going to be responsible for it. And that wraps up our webinar today. As always, if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, please feel free to contact us, to email us, or look for us on Skype. If you want us to review or discuss any or all components of your PMF, you're absolutely welcome to get in touch with Suzanne, Colleen, or myself, and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions. And so I think I'm going to end it here. We've just gone about a minute and a half over time. And if you have any questions, we'll save them for email or for Skype later on. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and it was great to touch base with you.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and looking forward to connecting with you all soon in all of our various different activities. And you're all unmuted, so you can all say bye.